out and into the shape. You have to use a variety that has got a fairly soft bendable growth. Some of them can be a bit brittle.
Which one is that?
This one is called Hinariki. It's a very bright orange fuchsia. And sometimes with the smaller flowered ones you lose the flowers within the mass of growth, so this sort of training just gives it a lot more impact. You see more flowers and less green. And you don't just have to do hoops. We've done spirals, we've done hot air balloons. The world's your oyster.
You could do a heart one.
You could do a heart. We've done a heart as well, yes. And that could look rather nice because then you have the fuchsia flowers straight down the bottom. I think that is probably about it.
I grow a lot of my fuchsias in hanging baskets, so you might well see several of them hanging from this pergola next year. I'm in the reclaimed garden, and the pergola is made from old oak. Now, it isn't cheap, I must say, but I think it looks very attractive indeed. I've also managed to get the raised vegetable beds in here too, and a couple of decorative chimney pots, which should cost you something like £20. Next year they'll be sprouting with flowers. And I'm also ready for the turf now, but with any landscaping job, you really need to do all the hard landscaping first, because that's the bit that makes the mess. So today I'm going to be working on this little pebble pool. Now, a pebble pool is ideal if you've got kids, because there's absolutely no dangers at all. And it's quite easy to make. This is a plastic water tank, which you can buy from the builders merchants, and I've just cut the top off with a hacksaw. Bear in mind that they are fairly floppy, so you do need to fill it up with water before you put the soil in at the sides, otherwise you'll distort the shape quite a lot. Now, you're going to need an electric pump in the pond, and that, of course, could be potentially quite dangerous. So make sure that you get an electrician to do the electrics for you, and that all the cables go through a piece of plastic water pipe. You won't be able to put a spade or a fork through that, so it's perfectly safe. Now, the pebbles are going to be supported with a bit of strong steel mesh, and what I've actually done is to wire a couple of pieces together just to make sure, and these are supported on bricks which are set in the tank as well. And then what you could do is to simply run a piece of hose pipe from the pump so that the water just bubbles up through the pebbles. It will look very attractive, and of course it's very simple to do. But I've gone one better. I got a young artist, Christian Funnell from Brighton, to make me up a sculpture which is made in the shape of a rose, and it's made out of an old copper hot water cylinder. And because it's copper, it'll soon weather down to this lovely green on there. And then what you do is to simply feed the pipe through the mesh here. Slot the rose on the top, and now that hose pipe will simply fix to the pump. I'll just slide on the top there. Now, bear in mind that when the water comes out of the fountain, it mustn't be too strong, because if it goes over the edge of this, it will gradually empty the water out of the tank. So what you need to do first of all is to adjust the water. Now, there are on all these pumps a little regulating valve here. So the first thing we need to do is to turn on the electricity and get the pump working. And when it's working, you just adjust the flow. That's actually running a little bit too fast, and I'm getting soaked to the skin here, so we'll just close it down a little bit. That's about right, I think. We'll switch the pump off now, and then the final job is to put the pebbles on the top. So with the last of the pebbles on, I think that's going to look rather nice. All we need to do now is to turn on the electricity. There we are, and that's going to look very splendid indeed, I think. We need to plant around it, of course, but that will have to wait for another time, because right now Pippa Greenwood investigates some dirty doings amongst the fruit trees.
Fire blight's a disease you dread finding in your garden. It's caused by the bacterium Erwinia amylovera and was first reported in this country back in 1957. Because of its potential to really devastate commercial apple and pear orchards, the Ministry of Agriculture took very stringent measures to try and contain the disease. They grubbed out entire orchards and turned it into a notifiable infection, which meant that if you found it, you were obliged to tell the ministry. That's no longer the case if you find it in your garden, unless you live in the Isle of Man, Northern Ireland or the Channel Islands. But wherever you live, fire blight is still something you've got to watch out for. The symptoms show up really clearly on something like this ornamental malus or crabapple. But it's not just apples and pears that it damages. It can also be a real nightmare on many ornamentals. Because in a bad year, fire blight can seriously wreck many of the commonly grown rosaceous ornamentals, things like sorbus, stranvasia, amelanchier, pyracantha, hawthorn, and of course cotoneaster. This one's just starting to show signs of the dieback, but give it a few months or maybe a year or two and the whole thing could be killed stone dead. Most infections occur when the plants are in flower, particularly when the weather's quite warm and damp. The bacteria enter the blossom, kill them off, and then the dieback moves along the stem and leaves behind it dry brown bunches of leaves which cling tightly, so the whole thing looks as if it's been scorched by fire. Then later in the season you get a brown or green canker developing, and from that comes a bacterial ooze. On pears it's an off-white colour, and on malus and edible apples it tends to be more of a golden brown. And the bacteria from that ooze are then spread to other potential host plants by insects, including bees, and also on air currents and by rain splash. So how do you know for sure that you have actually got fire blight? Well, the best thing to do is arm yourself with a decent sharp penknife, and at just about the point where the bark starts to shrink inwards and look as if it's dying back, you very carefully pare it away, and beneath you'll see that the wood and the undersurface of the bark is a foxy orangey red brown colour, which is often quite mottled, and that tells you that you've definitely got fire blight. Then as soon as you can, you need to prune out the infected area, and unlike with most diseases when you could get away with cutting to about here, just past where the staining ends, with fire blight you actually need to cut about 2 foot past that point. So that's about 1 foot, 2 foot up to there, to a good outward facing bud or bunch of leaves. And periodically, as you're doing a job like this, you really do want to dip your secateurs or pruning saw in a good disinfectant. And then when you get to the end of one tree, always make sure that you give the blades of the secateurs or the saw a really thorough scrub up in a disinfectant. And as to bits like these, what you don't want to do is risk leaving them around the garden or putting them on the compost heap. They've got to go either on the bonfire or in with the household rubbish. If a tree's got really badly infected and it's got lots of different points of infection like here, which are reaching quite close to the trunk, or if there are a lot of long brown totally dead stems, then it's really not worth saving, because by the time you've cut 2 foot past all of those, what you're left with isn't something you'd want in the garden. So then you've got to consider the ultimate, felling the tree and starting again. You're then going to need to consider the sort of things that might encourage the disease, and there's no doubt about it, a susceptible plant which is growing on either a very heavy clay or a very acid soil, or a plant which has been overfed and so is growing too vigorously, is far more susceptible to fire blight. Then there are the resistant cultivars and varieties and species, and you want to choose those wherever possible. So, for instance, if you're after a pyracantha, choose Teton or Mohave or Shawnee. All of those are a good investment. And if you want a pear, try Conference, or an apple, how about Fiesta or Royal Gala? Choose one of these and the chances are your plant will remain healthy and free from fire blight.
Yes, I've been having some success with my fruit crops too. A while ago, I planted some deep frozen strawberry runners that they claimed would crop within 60 days. And I promised that I would let you know what happened. And then I took myself off for 3 weeks, I'm afraid. So I can just tell you now that, yes, they did crop within 60 days. And these ones that were planted out in the soil did produce quite reasonable crops, about, I suppose, 3 or 4 berries per plant, which is not bad on small plants like this. And of course, next year they'll produce a full crop.